The decision to bring charges against President Trump was mine, but the basis for those charges rests entirely with President Trump and his actions.
The House Judiciary Committee released video of its closed-door 8-hour hearing with Jack Smith. Smith led 2 investigations and failed prosecutions of President Trump for his handling of classified documents and his role in attempting to overturn the 2020 election.
So did you develop evidence that President Trump was responsible for the violence at the Capitol on January 6th?
So our view of the evidence was that he caused it and that he exploited it.
Trump has continued to say that he did not do anything wrong on January 6th. Smith vocally defended his investigations against accusations from Republican lawmakers that the previous administration weaponized the justice system against Trump.
The evidence here made clear that President Trump was, by a large measure, the most culpable and most responsible person in this conspiracy. These crimes were committed for his benefit. The attack that happened at the Capitol as part of this case does not happen without him. I entirely disagree with any characterization that our work was in any way meant to hamper him in the presidential election. That's not who I am, and I think people who know me and my experience over 30 years would find that laughable.
So here's what's true. Special Counsel Jack Smith did deliver a final report to Congress and the public. The report does contain devastating evidence about Trump's efforts to overturn the 2020 election. Smith did conclude that the evidence was sufficient to convict Trump at trial. Those are all facts, real things that actually happened. But here's what's false, or at least wildly misleading. The idea that prison is inevitable, because it's not. Not even close. In fact, right now, Trump is completely shielded from prosecution. He's president again, and Department of Justice policy says you can't prosecute a sitting president. So despite all the evidence Smith compiled, Trump isn't going to prison anytime soon. Maybe not ever, because whether Trump goes to prison doesn't depend on the evidence. It depends on politics. It depends on elections. It depends on whether he ever loses power. So what actually happened? Jack Smith was appointed special counsel to investigate 2 things. First, Trump's efforts to overturn the 2020 election and his role in January 6th. Second, Trump's handling of classified documents at Mar-a-Lago. Smith spent years investigating. He brought indictments, he built cases, he was ready to go to trial. But then Trump won the 2024 election. And once Trump became president-elect, Smith had to drop the cases because you can't prosecute a sitting president. That's Department of Justice policy, not a law, just a policy. But it's powerful. And it means all of Smith's work, all that evidence, all those indictments, they just stop. The cases get dismissed. Not because Trump is innocent. Not because the evidence wasn't strong enough, but because he won an election and regained presidential power. But before dropping the cases, Smith did something important. He wrote a comprehensive report laying out everything he found, all the evidence, all the testimony, all the conclusions. And in that report, Smith said something really significant. He said that if Trump had not won the 2024 election, if Trump had remained a private citizen, the evidence was sufficient to obtain and sustain a conviction at trial. Let me repeat that. The special counsel said the evidence was strong enough to convict Trump. Not might convict, not possibly convict, strong enough to convict. That's a federal prosecutor saying, I had the goods. I could have won this case. But the only reason we're not proceeding is because the defendant became president again. And in closed-door testimony to Congress, Smith went even further. He called Trump the most culpable and most responsible person in the conspiracy to overturn the election. The most culpable, the most responsible person for an unprecedented criminal effort to overturn legitimate election results and retain power illegally. Those are strong words from a prosecutor who doesn't use words lightly. So the evidence is real. The conclusions are damning. The case was strong. All of that is true. But here's where the viral narratives go wrong. They take those true facts and jump straight to prison. Inevitable. And that's where they lose the plot. Because between strong evidence and Trump in a cell, there are about 1 million obstacles. Political obstacles, legal obstacles, constitutional obstacles, time obstacles. And pretending those don't exist, Pretending prison is inevitable when it's actually highly uncertain. That's misinformation. It's giving people false hope. It's setting them up for disappointment. So, buckle up, because we're about to dig into what Jack Smith's report actually says. Why Trump isn't going to prison now, what would have to happen for prison to become real, and why the gap between evidence and consequences tells you everything about how broken our accountability system is. Let's dig into what Jack Smith's report actually says. Because the details matter here. This isn't just some vague accusation. This is a comprehensive prosecutorial report backed by years of investigation, hundreds of witness interviews, and mountains of evidence. So we need to understand what Smith found and why he believes it was sufficient to convict. Then we'll talk about why none of that matters as long as Trump stays in power. The report describes Trump's conduct as an unprecedented criminal effort to overturn the legitimate results of the 2020 election in order to retain power, not political maneuvering, criminal effort. Smith lays out how Trump knew he lost the election, how his own advisors told him there was no significant fraud, how courts rejected his claims, how recounts confirmed the results, and how despite all of that, Trump launched a multi-pronged scheme to stay in power. The report documents Trump pressuring state officials to find votes or change results. It details the fake elector scheme where Trump's team created fraudulent certificates claiming he won states he actually lost. It describes Trump's pressure campaign on Vice President Pence to refuse to certify the electoral count, and it covers Trump's actions on January 6th when a mob attacked the Capitol. Smith's conclusion is blunt. The evidence shows Trump knew he lost. He knew the fraud claims were false, and he pursued illegal means to stay in power anyway. That's criminal intent. That's consciousness of guilt. And Smith didn't just collect this evidence himself. He brought it before a federal grand jury, regular citizens who heard the evidence and voted to indict. That means ordinary Americans looked at what Smith presented and said, yes, there's probable cause to believe these crimes occurred. That's significant. And here's what makes the evidence particularly strong. It's not just testimony from Trump's enemies. The key witnesses are Trump's own people, his own White House staff, his own campaign advisors, his own lawyers, his own vice president, people who worked for him, people who supported him. And they testified under oath that Trump knew he lost and pursued illegal schemes anyway. That's devastating evidence when your own team says you committed crimes. That's hard to overcome at trial. Now, let's talk about the classified documents case. This one is even more clear-cut. After Trump left office in 2021, he took hundreds of classified documents to Mar-a-Lago. The government asked for them back. Trump's lawyers negotiated and returned some, but Trump kept hiding more. The FBI executed a search warrant. They found over 300 classified documents, some marked top secret, some containing national security information. Trump wasn't supposed to have any of them. And instead of returning them when asked, he allegedly orchestrated efforts to hide them from investigators. He allegedly told staff to move boxes. He allegedly had security footage deleted. This is textbook obstruction of justice. And here's the kicker. In other cases, people go to prison for this stuff. Reality Winner leaked one classified document. She got 5 years in prison. Harold Martin hoarded classified documents at his home. He got 9 years. The list goes on. People regularly get significant prison sentences for mishandling classified information. The classified documents case against Trump is worse than most of these in terms of volume and willful obstruction. Smith had him dead to rights. So when Smith says the evidence was sufficient to obtain and sustain a conviction at trial, he's not exaggerating. He's giving his professional prosecutorial assessment that these cases were winners. And in his congressional testimony, Smith stood by everything. He told lawmakers he saw Trump as, by a large measure, the most culpable person in the conspiracy. He said the office stood fully behind the prosecutions. He made clear that the only reason they didn't proceed was Department of Justice's policy against prosecuting sitting presidents and Trump's return to power. Now, here's why all of this evidence doesn't actually mean Trump is going to prison. Department of Justice has a long-standing policy that you cannot indict a sitting president. The reasoning is that prosecuting the president would interfere with their constitutional duties. It would create a situation where the executive branch is prosecuting its own leader. So the policy says, if you have evidence the president committed crimes, you can investigate, you can document it, you can preserve it, but you can't charge them while they're in office. The remedy for a criminal president is impeachment by Congress. This means Trump is completely shielded from federal prosecution right now. He's president. Department of Justice can't touch him. The Smith cases are dead, dismissed, gone, and they'll stay that way for at least 4 years, maybe longer if he somehow stays in power beyond that. So all that evidence Smith compiled, all those witnesses, all those documents, they just sit there preserved on the record, but not actionable, not while Trump is president. This is what legal analysts mean when they talk about Trump's situation as a fork in the road. As long as he stays in power, he's protected. The moment he loses power, he's vulnerable. And here's where the presidency or prison framing comes from. Before the 2024 election, analysts pointed out that Trump faced 2 possible futures. If he won, he'd become president, halt the prosecutions, and shield himself through presidential power. If he lost, he'd face trial on multiple felony counts. The election literally determined whether he went to the White House or potentially to jail. He chose White House, and that electoral victory is his shield right now. It's not innocence. It's not lack of evidence. It's power. Political power translated into legal immunity. But here's what the viral narratives get wrong. They act like the evidence guarantees future prosecution and conviction. It doesn't. Here's why. First, Trump has to lose power. He has to finish his second term and not find some way to extend it. That's 4 years from now, minimum. Second, even after he leaves office, someone has to decide to prosecute him. That's Department of Justice, which will be controlled by whoever is president next. If it's a Republican who wants to protect Trump, no prosecution. If it's a Democrat who wants accountability, maybe prosecution. It's a political decision. Third, even if charges are filed, Trump will fight them. Appeals, delays, legal motions. Fourth, the Supreme Court has given presidents broad immunity for official acts. Trump will argue everything he did was official. Fighting that will take years. Fifth, even if a case gets to trial and Trump is convicted, sentencing is up to a judge, and judges have discretion. They can give probation, they can give house arrest. Prison isn't automatic even after conviction. And sixth, Trump will be old. He's 78 now. By the time his term ends, he'll be 82. By the time any trials conclude, he could be in his mid-82nds. Judges often show leniency based on age and health. So prison is not inevitable, it's possible. It's more possible than for any previous president. The evidence exists, but it depends on a chain of events that all have to break against Trump. He has to leave office. A future Department of Justice has to prosecute. Courts have to reject immunity claims. Trials have to proceed. Convictions have to happen. Judges have to impose prison sentences. That's a lot of ifs. That's not inevitable. That's highly uncertain. So here's the reality. Jack Smith's report establishes that Trump committed serious crimes that would have resulted in conviction if not for his return to power. That's huge. That's unprecedented. It means the evidence is there. The case is documented. But it doesn't mean Trump is definitely going to prison. What it means is Trump's best defense is staying in power. And the moment he loses it, if he ever does, he faces serious legal jeopardy. Prison becomes a real possibility. Not a certainty, but a real possibility in a way it isn't for any other former president. Let's break this down into what actually matters, because there are crucial lessons here about power, accountability, and why understanding the gap between evidence and consequences is essential. So let's go point by point. Point number 1, evidence doesn't equal accountability when the person with the evidence against them has enough power to avoid consequences. This is the fundamental lesson. Jack Smith compiled overwhelming evidence. Evidence that would convict almost anyone else. Evidence of election interference, evidence of obstruction, evidence of mishandling classified information, the kind that sends regular people to prison for years. But Trump isn't in prison. He's president because he won an election. And that electoral victory gave him the power to shut down the prosecutions. This is how power works. The evidence matters. It's documented. It's preserved. It's on the record. But evidence alone doesn't produce justice. Justice requires institutions with the power and will to hold people accountable. And when the person who committed the crimes controls those institutions or is protected by policies, evidence just sits there, documented but unenforced. This is why the Department of Justice policy against prosecuting sitting presidents is so consequential. It was designed for normal times. The assumption was that Congress would impeach serious criminals and voters wouldn't elect them. But what happens when Congress is too polarized to impeach and voters do elect someone with serious criminal exposure? The policy becomes a shield for criminality rather than a safeguard for governance. Trump used an election victory to escape prosecution. The policy that was supposed to protect presidential function is instead protecting presidential impunity. Point number 2. The presidency or prison dynamic fundamentally corrupts our political system. Think about what this means. Trump is facing serious legal jeopardy the moment he loses power. So his entire political existence is now about maintaining power. Not for policy reasons, not for ideological goals, for personal survival to avoid prison. Every election becomes existential for him. Every political battle is about staying in office and staying out of jail. This creates perverse incentives. It means Trump will do anything to maintain power because losing power means potential prison. It means he might push constitutional boundaries to avoid stepping down. It means he might try to delegitimize future elections. It means his entire presidency is shadowed by the knowledge that accountability waits the moment he's no longer protected. And this corruption spreads through the entire system. His appointees know their jobs depend on keeping him in power. His party knows they're tied to his fate. His supporters are motivated by tribal loyalty. The whole political apparatus becomes about shielding Trump from consequences rather than governing. And future politicians learn the lesson. If you can win the presidency, you can escape accountability, even for serious crimes, even with overwhelming evidence. Just stay in power long enough. That's not how democracies work. That's how authoritarian systems work. Point number 3, the misinformation about inevitable prison creates false hope that undermines sustained accountability efforts. When narratives claim prison is inevitable, they're setting people up for massive disappointment. People watch those narratives. They believe justice is coming. They think the evidence guarantees consequences. They relax. They stop demanding accountability. And then years pass. Trump finishes his term. Maybe a future administration decides prosecuting an ex-president sets bad precedents. Maybe the Supreme Court immunity rulings make prosecution impossible. Maybe he dies before trial. And suddenly the inevitable prison everyone was promised never happens. And all those people who believed it was inevitable, they become cynical. They think the system is rigged. They stop believing accountability is possible. This is incredibly dangerous because real accountability requires sustained public pressure. It requires people staying engaged. It requires organizing and demanding and pushing institutions to do their jobs. But if people think justice is inevitable, if they believe the evidence alone will produce consequences, they stop doing that work. And then when consequences don't materialize, the window for accountability closes. The Jack Smith report gives us the foundation for future accountability. It documents the crimes. It preserves the evidence. But turning that foundation into actual consequences requires political will and sustained pressure. Lying to people that it's inevitable undercuts the very effort needed to make it real. Point number 4, understanding the real dynamics is the first step to creating actual accountability. So let's be clear about what would have to happen for Trump to actually face prison time. Step 1, Trump has to leave office. That means serving out his term and not finding some way to extend it. That's 4 years from now. Step 2, the 2028 election has to produce a president willing to let Department of Justice pursue Trump. Step 3, Department of Justice would have to revive the cases or bring new ones based on Smith's evidence. Step 4, courts would have to reject Trump's immunity claims. That could take years of appeals. Step 5, trials would have to proceed and produce convictions. Step 6, judges would have to impose prison sentences rather than probation. And Trump would have to be healthy enough to serve them. That's the real path from evidence to prison. And every one of those steps is uncertain. Everyone depends on political will and legal outcomes. We can't predict. This doesn't mean we shouldn't try. It doesn't mean accountability is impossible. It means it's hard and uncertain and requires sustained effort. And understanding that reality is better than believing false promises. Because when we understand the real obstacles, we can work to overcome them. We can elect people committed to accountability. We can demand Department of Justice independence. We can maintain pressure. But if we believe it's inevitable, subscribe and don't miss me on YouTube. I'll bring you the hottest and most accurate news about current events in the US.